everyone, today I'm going to make the Patagonia Fleece dupe. I love this pattern, it's absolutely gorgeous. Now, the Patagonia fleeces are everywhere, and actually it's not just Patagonia anymore, lots of other designers make them. But on my pin board, I've been starting to see myself pin more and more of these cozy fleeces. So I thought, why not try and make one? I had a look on Etsy and I found this really cute pattern, which was the Let It Snow pattern. It was the Let It Snow fleece. So this is going to be a little bit of a sew along of how I made this huge cozy fleece. So I hope you enjoy watching and let me know what you think. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe for more sewing content.
Now, here's me doing my least favourite job of any sewing project, which is sticking my PDF pattern together. I've seen these new amazing ditto machines that project your pattern onto your fabric. I feel like I need one. Anyway, here's me doing it the old-fashioned way. So, the fabric I bought, I got Polar Fleece, which is fleecy on both sides. I got blue and cream. I also bought a 7-inch zip that will go on the breast pocket on the chest. I got some bias binding, which had a little bit of stretch in it, and that's what's going to be used to finish off all of the cuffs and the collars. Now, I completely forgot to buy a dark blue thread, so I just used what I had in my stash, and I used a black thread and a white thread. I also bought this anti-rip canvas-like material that will be used for the plackets where the buttons will go. Now, let's get around to cutting out our fleece. So I'm just laying it out so it's all nice and flat and ready to get cutting. Then on the fold, I'm going to place the back piece down. I'm also using my handy soap container because the girl doesn't have pattern weights, so I'm making do with what I've got. Next, I'm going to cut two of the front pieces. So these are in two sections, even though I'm cutting it on the fold for ease. I'm just going to cut that into two pieces. Next, I'm going to cut two pieces of the collar for around the neck, then one long rectangle for the pocket that goes on the breast. Finally, in the blue fabric, I'm doing the arms, so I need two of these, one for each side. And here are all my blue pieces of fleece. Next, I'm moving on to the canvas fabric to cut out the two pieces for the placket. We're also going to cut out two interfacing pieces of the placket shape that will then be ironed on to the placket fabric to give it some structure. Enter the cream fabric. Now this section's really easy because we're just doing the front on the fold and the back on the fold and then a few pockets. So here's the front piece, and then I'm going to just do the back piece on the other side and then some pockets. And voila, here are all of the pieces ready to go. Now, one other thing I'm doing is cutting out all of the little notches. So this pattern has a lot of notches because there's lots of areas that all need to stick together. So I'm just making sure that I mark all of those before I start the project. Now we are almost ready to sew, but first things first, I want to go and iron on the interfacing onto the placket fabric just to give it that structure and also to make sure that all my bits and bobs are done before I actually start the sewing process. The first thing we're going to do is mark out where we want the pocket to go on the fleece. I'm using a small template and then a chalk pen to mark it on. I did not realise that this chalk pen actually transfers onto my table and leaves a mark. But we move. I draw a line where I want the pocket to go, and then I mark the beginning and the end with a pin. So from the other side, I can really clearly see where that line will be. Facing the zip down, I secure it in place with a pin. Now you'll realise this project takes a lot of pins, but it's very worth doing, and it takes a bit of time, but it's worth it because it just means that everything stays in place. So I'm going to pin that in really neatly all the way from the end to the other end so it's nice and secure. You can see that as I'm going, I keep checking to make sure that I'm staying on that straight line that I drew on the back. Here's a little bit of a close-up of what I've been doing. Now, about halfway through, I realised, oh my gosh, I can't actually sew along those lines that I've just done that are horizontal. So I'll need to put some more in that are vertical so my machine can go across them. So this will just help to keep the zip in place while I'm sewing. Next, we're going to sew along the line of where we've just put those pins in, but we're going to remove those pins so you can't see them. But roughly that's where you want to sew. So you're close to the teeth, probably about 5 to 6 millimeters away from the teeth. And when we finish that, get to the end of the zip and backstitch. Now for the other side of the zip, I'm going to flip that zip so the teeth are on the outside edge. You can see both sets of teeth are now facing the outside. Now I'm going to tack that down with the ribbon sides touching each other. You can see that that zip is actually turned inside out. Now we're going to sew that in place. So you're going to sew a straight line along the ribbon close to the teeth but not touching. When we get to the end of that, you're going to backstitch. Next, I'm going to cut the polar fleece. So we're not cutting the ribbon of the zip, we are just cutting the fleece, and we are creating a small hole for that zip to be fed through. You'll see it takes a little bit of maneuvering, but what I'm going to do is flip that zip inside so that actually from the outside we just have an almost invisible zip which will be on the breast pocket. And here is what it looks like when it's all turned out nicely. Now it's time to add the pocket to our zip. So I've got the pocket piece here and I'm going to measure out where the center is and then match that up to the center of the zip to make sure it's all aligned. I'm then going to secure that in place on the ribbon of the zipper and sew along that line. It can be a little bit tricky when you take it over to the sewing machine, so just go slowly and make sure that you're only sewing it to that one side of the zip and that you're not catching any other fleece fabric in there. Once that's all done, we're going to backstitch and then flip it over so we can attach the other side of the pocket. We're going to attach that to the top part of the zip, and again, we're only going to be sewing it to that ribbon, and that will just keep it all nice and secure and make that pocket shape for us. Then I'm going to tack together the two loose edges and sew them together so that we have our pocket. I wish it was that quick to do. Now the jacket is really starting to take shape, so we're going to attach the shoulders. So flipping the fabrics right sides together, we're going to attach the shoulders and tack them and sew them together. I used a normal straight stitch to do this and then left a 1 centimetre seam allowance. Before I finish the shoulders, I want to neaten up all of this loose seam allowance I've got, and I'm going to top stitch it all down so it's nice and secure and doesn't look messy from the inside. You can see here, this is what it looks like when it's all done. Next, I'm moving on to the collar. So I attach the center of the collar to the center of the collar on the fleece, which I've just created. I do that with right sides together, and I start from the inside first. We're basically going to create a little bit of a sandwich with this collar, so it's all going to be neatly tucked inside all of the loose edges. We're then going to get the other piece, and again, with the right sides together, you can see I've measured the center out here. I'm going to pin that in place using the pins I've used for the other side. So I haven't sewn anything yet. I'm just currently creating a bit of a sandwich to make sure that the collar all fits, and it should join up at each of the ends. Once that's all secured and in place and we're happy with the fitting, we're going to then sew that on, and you can see I'm just really slowly taking my time and making sure that everything is all sandwiched in place and no extra fabric is caught in the middle. Now, after sewing that in place, the next thing we need to do is sew both of those pieces together along the top, and there will be a raw edge on the top. You'll see what I do in a second. So I fold that over and secure the pins at the top, and I'm going to sew along that line. As I said, there'll be a raw edge at the top, but that's fine because we'll be filling it out with bias binding. Here we go. And right, next I'm going to grab my bias binding and I measure this out along the collar. And now normally you'd think that you'd fill it out all the way, but I measure it and I cut probably a few inches shorter. That gives it that nice, more structured fit around the neck rather than it being quite baggy. It gives it almost like that closeness to your body. You can see again, I've measured out where the center of the bias binding is, and I'm ever so slightly stretching that as I'm going to make sure that it meets at both ends. It takes a little bit of maneuvering, but when you get that bias binding sorted, it looks perfect. Now we're moving back over to the iron with our interfaced pieces that we made earlier. So I'm going to fold them both in half and make sure I've created a really nice structured line along each of the pieces. Ignore all of the steam, and then what I'm going to do is fold in one side. It doesn't matter which one. by just about 1 centimetre and fold that in as well. So you can see this is what it should look like when it's all finished. I'm going to do that on both of the pieces as well. This is what we'll be using. It's almost the placket along our front where the buttons will go. Here you go, here's a little bit of a close-up of what they'll look like. So on one side, I'm going to fold it in half and I'm going to sew along the bottom, leaving one of the sides exposed. So you can see here, I'm not changing too much, I'm just simply folding it inside out and sewing along the bottom. Once that's done with a straight line, I'm going to snip that and then turn it inside out so it's all really nice and straight and secure. If you want to at this stage, you can go and iron it again, but mine was still really nice and secure. Then I'm going to stitch it, well, start to secure it onto the fleece. So with the interfacing side that's raw facing upwards, you're going to pin that in place along one side of the fleece. We're then going to sew that in along there. So it's going to be not covering the blue part, you're going to be just sewing on the interfacing. Once that's all done, you can then fold the interfacing in so it's all neatly concealed, and we go back over it and top stitch. It just makes it all look really nice and tightly tucked away so there's no messy strings or anything on show. Now we're going to do the same process to both sides, so just repeat that on the opposite side. Next, we're moving on to the arm. So the first thing to do here is to get your bias binding, and I measured roughly my wrist shape, and then I put that next to the fleece, and again you'll notice that this is not long enough, so I've made it ever so slightly shorter than what it should be, again so it's nice and tight around my wrist. I'm finding the center of where my sleeve is and the center of the bias binding and just securing that in place. It will take a bit of stretching, but again, once it's all done, it will be nice and snug to your wrists. Now, getting the back of the fleece back on the table, I'm going to measure out where the arms need to go. So at the center of the arm, I'm going to measure again the center of the fleece and make sure that I'm measuring it all up so it fits perfectly, so the arm will fit in that hole of the fleece. It can sometimes be a bit tricky to do this, so make sure you're just following the curvature of the arm and you can't go too wrong, and at least make sure that both edges match up. Once that's all pinned in place and secured, you're then going to move over to sew. Again, we're going to do this to both of the arms, so just repeat the process on both sides. Now the top of the fleece is almost done, we're going to apply our pockets to the bottom section. So you're going to place the pocket onto your fabric, do it the right way around first, other than, unlike what I did, here you go, the long piece should be at the bottom, almost like a semicircle. You're going to sew in between where the two notches are, you're not going to sew the whole length of the pocket. So there should be roughly 1 inch at either side that you're not going to sew. You'll see here, when I don't actually go to the end, I just stop and backstitch. There we go. Now we're going to get back to cutting our notches. Now we've done that, we're going to actually turn that pocket inside out. And these little notches here will actually help us to turn it out a little bit more. Here you go. So I'm going to slowly fold it, and you can see that little section that I didn't sew. That's why that's coming in handy. So you should be able to almost see that there's a new line forming, which we'll be sewing along later, that won't affect the pocket. Next, I'm going to just top stitch the pocket down to secure it so it doesn't start flapping out. And this is what it looks like when it's done. Okay, now we need to sew the other part of the pocket to it. So place it on so it all matches, and we're going to start to secure that into place and sew along the edge. This is going to create that pocket shape. Make sure that you backstitch at the end. Here you go, you can see what it looks like now. So this is the pocket and it's working, fully functioning pocket. The next thing we're going to do is just sew that to the bottom of the fleece. Again, this will just then be captured when we are bias binding it. Here you go, it's more secure now and the pocket is fully complete. With the bias binding, I'm going to grab some and again, make it ever so shorter than what the actual fabric is, just again, so it's nice and snug around the waist and not too baggy. What I will do to apply the bias binding is again, find the center of the fleece and then make it match to both of the edges. As we've done before with all the bias binding, you sew it down with the wrong side facing up and then you flip the bias binding over and then you sew it all down nice and flat. So it's all secured and all of the rough edges are on the inside of the binding. Now, because I'm using blue bias binding and I know this is going to be top stitched down, I'm actually having to swap my thread. So this is just one thing to consider while making this, is make sure that you've got all of your threads nice and matching and you're not accidentally sewing down the bias binding in the wrong colour. Anyway, now we've got both of our sides bias bound together, we're then going to place them together right sides facing and sew the edges. Be extra careful around the pocket because you don't want to accidentally get any of the wrong parts of the fabric in it. Sew that all down nice and securely with roughly a 1 centimetre edge. And voila, now we have our bottom piece. We're now going to attach this to the top piece. We're going to do the back first, making sure that the underarms all match up so it's nice and secure. And then we're going to sew that in place. We'll next move on to the front part, which is a little bit more tricky, but the back is a nice easy bit. Try and keep as straight as possible as well. If you're using a contrasting fabric, doing it wonkily can show up very easily. All right, you can see I'm matching here now the underarm and making sure that it goes all the way to the front center and the placket is ever so slightly off. So I'm going to make sure that I cover that while I sew. Here you go. It does take a bit of making sure it looks all nice and neat and secure and it's all lined up at the collar as well, because the worst thing would be that you have one side that's higher than the other. There you go, sew that all in place and I finished it off with these cute little zigzag shears. So I could have top stitched that down, but I decided that I didn't want to do that and I'm going to just use these little zigzag shears to neaten it all off and finish it off. I also decided to bind some of the inside sections, specifically around the zip that you can just see. And next it's onto the buttons. So I bought some popper buttons from eBay. These were sew-on buttons, and if I was to do this again, I would use some of the grommet buttons that you can get where you basically puncture a hole and then punch them in and it's a job well done. However, I had to sit there while I was watching Selling Sunset and just hand sew them in on a Sunday morning, which took a long time. So yeah, definitely my learning for this would be get some poppers because they would just make the button process so much quicker. I'm not here for hand sewing, I like quick sewing. I'm so pleased with how this turned out. I obviously made this in a huge size and I made this one for my partner, but I made a smaller one for myself, which fits much better.